The story of General Alexander Löhr is not just one of military brilliance, but a tale of ambition, betrayal, and tragic downfall. At the height of World War II, he was one of the most powerful men in the Luftwaffe, commanding air fleets and planning military strategies that affected the course of the war. But in the end, it wasn't his enemies on the battlefield that defeated him. Instead, it was the very system he swore allegiance to, one that would eventually condemn him to a firing squad. How did a man once revered as a military genius become a casualty of a crumbling empire? To understand this, we must look into the life of one of WWII's most complex figures. Alexander Löhr was born in Vienna in 1885, long before the rise of the Nazis. His early years were spent in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire's military, and it was there that his passion for aviation took flight. By the time the world plunged into the chaos of World War I, Löhr was already an experienced pilot, a role that would mark the beginning of his lifelong love affair with the sky. It was during these formative years that he understood the power of air superiority and how crucial it would become in future conflicts. But this wasn't just a hobby for Löhr. It was his path to greatness. The end of World War I marked a shift in the European landscape, with the once mighty empires crumbling and new powers emerging. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party rose to prominence with promises of restoring Germany to its former glory. Like many military men of his time, Löhr found himself caught in the currents of political change. When Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany in 1938, the opportunity for a career in the new Reich was too great for him to ignore. This was a man driven by duty, by honor, and a belief that the future of his nation would be shaped by military dominance. And so, he embraced the new order. In the early 1940s, just as the Nazi war machine began its assault across Europe, Löhr's ascent within the Luftwaffe was meteoric. He was named commander of Air Fleet 4 during the Battle of France and was soon appointed to higher positions, where he commanded forces in the Mediterranean and Balkans. By then, his name was becoming synonymous with precision and effectiveness in the Luftwaffe. He wasn't just another officer, he was a leader who understood the intricacies of air warfare. As general of the Luftwaffe, Löhr became a key figure in Hitler's strategy. He had a mind for detail, and was a man who believed in the importance of complete military control. His early successes led him to command the Luftwaffe 4 in the Mediterranean, where his tactics would be tested in the unforgiving skies. This was a region of war that saw the Luftwaffe clash with the Allies in one of the most intense and crucial fronts of the war. With Italy on his side and Germany behind him, Löhr's task was monumental: prevent the Allies from seizing air dominance in a region critical to the Nazis' ambitions. Löhr's initial success in the Mediterranean was undeniable. His forces were instrumental in defeating British forces in North Africa and launching offensive strikes on Allied convoys. For a time, his aggressive approach to air strategy seemed to pay off. His men revered him, and the soldiers under his command admired his tactical brilliance and charismatic leadership. But there was more to Löhr than just a competent officer. There was a man consumed by the will to win, a man who could be relentless and unforgiving. However, as the tide of the war shifted, cracks began to show in his leadership. By the time the Allies launched their successful invasion of Sicily in 1943, the Luftwaffe had been stretched to its limits. Resources were thinning, and the strategic advantage once held by Nazi Germany was beginning to evaporate. But Löhr, ever the perfectionist, refused to acknowledge defeat. It was in these moments of desperation that his tactics became more erratic, more ruthless. Civilians became just as much a target as military installations. It was this shift in tactics, this escalation of violence, that began to alienate him from the higher echelons of Nazi leadership. Though the Luftwaffe under his command continued to launch airstrikes, it was becoming clear that the Allied forces had adapted. Air superiority was no longer the deciding factor. The German forces, though formidable, could not sustain their power in the face of such determined opposition. And while Löhr fought on, hoping for a breakthrough that never came, whispers of his failures began to surface in the Reich. The cracks were no longer just visible to the Allied forces, they were becoming painfully obvious to the Nazi leadership. But what truly set the stage for his downfall was not just his failure to secure victory in the Mediterranean, but his growing isolation from the core principles of Nazi ideology. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler's inner circle became more and more paranoid, seeking scapegoats for the regime's growing list of failures. No one in the Nazi high command, it seemed, was safe. For a man like Löhr, whose career had been built on loyalty to the Führer, it was becoming increasingly clear that the very loyalty he had given to the Nazi state would be his undoing. Löhr's downfall came swiftly. Arrested by the Gestapo in the aftermath of several disastrous military campaigns, he was accused of incompetence and betrayal, charges that were as much about the failure of the Nazi regime as they were about his own tactical errors. The general, once hailed as a military mastermind, had become a liability to a regime that no longer had room for failure. As the world watched the collapse of Nazi Germany, it wasn't just the soldiers on the front lines who felt the pressure. The political elite, the commanders of vast military forces, and even the Luftwaffe's once proud generals were now facing the same brutal reckoning. Alexander Löhr, a man once celebrated for his strategic brilliance, now stood at the precipice of disgrace, and his story would be defined not by victories, but by his ultimate fall from grace. By the summer of 1944, the Nazis' fate was sealed. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the pressure of the Soviet Red Army, and Hitler's dreams of an invincible Third Reich were turning to dust. For many in the military, this was the beginning of the end. But for General Löhr, this was where the true cost of loyalty would be revealed. Löhr's role in the war, particularly in the Balkans, was beginning to look more and more like a series of catastrophic failures. The Luftwaffe under his command had been unable to stop the Allied advances in Italy and later in southern France. The once promising air campaigns had devolved into a series of desperate strikes, marking the beginning of the Luftwaffe's decline. To make matters worse, the brutal tactics he had used in the region, including indiscriminate bombings of civilian areas, had earned him the disdain of many. Despite his strategic genius, it was these very tactics that would lead to his downfall. As the Allies made significant strides in the Mediterranean, capturing key territories, the Luftwaffe's defeat was undeniable. Yet it was not just the loss of territory that turned the tide against Löhr. The General A.S. refusal to adapt to the changing dynamics of warfare, particularly his insistence on continuing to wage an air war that Germany could no longer win, marked him as a liability. By the fall of 1944, the internal pressure on the Nazi leadership had reached a boiling point. As the Allies advanced and the reality of defeat set in, Hitler's paranoia deepened. He demanded that his generals take full responsibility for their failures. And the once proud officers who had once sworn unwavering allegiance to the Reich were now being cast aside. General Löhr, with his failed campaigns and the mounting civilian casualties in the Balkans, became a prime target. In early 1945, as Germany's collapse became imminent, Löhr was arrested by the Gestapo, accused of failure in the Mediterranean theater and, more importantly, of being a scapegoat for the regime's military missteps. His fate was sealed. The trial, if it could even be called that, was little more than a formality. With the war winding down and Hitler's regime in its final throes, the generals who had once been treated as kings of the battlefield were now expendable pawns, blamed for the incompetence of the Nazi leadership. The accusations against him were not only based on military failures, but also on his actions during the war. The Luftwaffe's bombings of civilian populations in the Balkans had long been a source of controversy, and as the war ended, these war crimes came into sharper focus. Löhr was charged with crimes against humanity, along with charges of incompetence and treason. What followed was a trial that was neither just nor fair. As the Allies liberated Europe and the Nazi regime began to crumble, those who had stood beside Hitler now found themselves condemned by their own countrymen. In Löhr's case, the trial was a mere formality, one that sought only to assign blame. The once feared general was convicted of war crimes, his punishment already decided. Löhr's execution was carried out on February 19, 1947, in Austria, a grim marker of the price that those who had served the Nazi regime had to pay. He was executed by a firing squad, a stark contrast to the man who had once commanded the skies. The military genius who had once directed the vast power of the Luftwaffe was reduced to a condemned prisoner facing the very death he had so often meted out to others. His death was not the heroic martyrdom of a fallen general. It was a quiet, ignoble end. A man executed by the very system he had worked for. Löhr's execution was part of a broader wave of accountability after the war, one that saw many prominent figures of the Nazi regime face justice for their actions. But his story was different. He wasn't one of the most infamous war criminals like Göring or Himmler. Yet his demise serves as a sobering reminder of the costs of blind loyalty. His failure to adapt to the changing nature of the war, combined with his complicity in the Luftwaffe's brutal tactics, marked him as an example of the moral and military collapse that defined the later stages of the Third Reich. In the aftermath of his death, Alexander Löhr was relegated to the shadows of history. His legacy was one of ruin, a sharp contrast to the man who had once been considered one of Germany's brightest military minds. His story became a cautionary tale for future generations, of a man who had risen to great heights only to be brought low by the very forces he had served. The fall of Alexander Löhr is not just the story of a man's demise. It is the story of an empire's disintegration. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of power, the consequences of war, and the ultimate price of loyalty to a regime that was doomed from the start. His journey from a highly respected Luftwaffe general to a man facing execution is a testament to the inevitable downfall of those who, for all their brilliance, fail to recognize when the tides of history are turning against them.